It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Stephen K. Baskerville, and we're going to be discussing his new book, A Gentleman's Guide to Manners, Sex, and Ruling the World, How to Survive as a Man in the Age of Misandry and Do So with Grace. Stephen, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Now, this is the first time Stephen and I are meeting, and I know he's going to be brand new to all of you in the audience. So we're going to kick things off by having Stephen share a bit of the Stephen K. Baskerville origin story. So, Stephen, for all of us encountering you for the first time in this talk today, what are a few things we should know about you?
Well, this is my first foray into this kind of book. I've written some semi-scholarly books in the past on subjects like religion and the politics of the family and sexuality and things like that. But this is my first kind of self-help book, my first guidebook for gentlemen. Of course, it's not a new genre at all. Books like this go back to the Middle Ages. But I felt like it had to be something a little different for today's man. That today's aspiring man or gentleman has different challenges than in the past. And the more as I read other books from the past and the present, I felt that they were not adequate. So I decided it was time to write my own. That's where it came from.
And I was semi-aware that there was a long history of this sort of literature, but in terms of like research, idea, what did it look like to prepare to put this volume together?
Well, I did go back to some of the classics. The Renaissance is really where this kind of thing took off. The most famous books are Castiglione's The Courtier, of course, and Machiavelli's The Prince, which are not typical, but they do kind of show, especially Machiavelli shows that they're really an important part of this. It's not just refinement and little affectations and things. It's about ruling in some sense. And then I saw there were English-speaking classics like Thomas Eliot's The Governor, and I looked at those and some of the others up through the Victorian period, American and British. So that was the background. And then I read some of today's manuals, Miss Manners, Emily Post, a book by Emily Post's grandson. There's many of these manuals on the internet now, books on manliness and as well as on manners. So I looked at them. I took what I thought was important, and I expressed where I felt differently.
And I'd love for you to set the stage of maybe that ideal reader that you were writing to, because it's no mystery that there's breakdown in family that's contributing to challenges with, especially with younger people, but even older men still trying to figure out what does it mean to be a man. We've lost a lot of the mentors, the heroes that maybe we would have looked to in earlier times for guidance on what it looks like to be a man. So in terms of kind of the macro level of the struggle, what is the world that your book is attempting to speak into?
Well, it's really addressed to all men. I suppose it's addressed more to young men than to old men, but not really. As I point out in the book, it's never too late to be a gentleman. It's a lifelong enterprise, endeavor to fulfill the ideals. None of us do it completely, but it's something to strive toward. So historically, these books tend to be written by older men and directed to younger men. But there's no age limit. Ideally, these rules, these principles are handed down from father to son. But that's never really been reliable. We've always had over the centuries, we've had peasants moving to the cities, and they have to learn how to behave like civilized people and in the urban dwellers and so forth, and citizens. And so that's really the kind of people it's addressed to.
Next, I'd love for you to kind of give us what's the working definition of a gentleman. I think if we use that phrase in culture, people think of somebody with a bow tie, maybe a top hat, a cane. Like people have all kinds of interesting cultural references. But I don't know that many of us have ever pressed into like, oh, what does it mean to be a gentleman? And what would it look like for me to be a gentleman?
Right. Well, really, the book is an extended definition in what it means to be a gentleman. There's nowhere where I offer 25 words or less definition. And those which I've seen attempt to do that is not very satisfying. It's something that's been debated over the centuries. It's the subject of many novels in the 19th century by people like Dickens and Trollope and others, Jane Austen. It's been the subject of plays by Shakespeare. It's been the subject of poems, films, and advice books like this one. So it's constantly evolving. There's always been a kind of tension between the idea of a gentleman as a status, a class status. In other words, a member of the gentry class or the aristocracy in England, the lower aristocracy in England, and the moral element, the idea of ethical comportment and proper behavior and so forth, which of course is open to anyone. So over the centuries, those who have wanted to define it in terms of a class status have always been challenged. Have always been challenged by those who believe that they're not living up to the ideal, the ethical ideal. So there's always this tension, and of course with America and the other English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, the class element has somewhat, not entirely, disappeared, and the ethical element has taken priority. So that's really what it is. It's all of us trying to be our well. One thing, let's say, for this book, one thing I've tried to emphasize is there's always been an element implicitly of ruling. Maybe not ruling in the sense of being a politician, but ruling your own domain that you're given as a man, whether it's your home, your family, yourself, or anything else to which you might be called. So there's implicit in the idea of that is not just manners or proper behavior or social graces, but you are in some sense governing something and someone.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the themes I noted as I was taking notes to get ready for the interviews. That idea of self leadership and how that changes how others perceive us, how we perceive ourselves, how we act. But that also has a ripple effect on those kind of in our sphere of influence, our friends, our family, people in our workplace, and so that leading of self has an impact on us and those outside of us as well. I think if I could pick one part of the book for every single man in the world to read, it'd be the section on basics. I feel like some of those basics are places we've fallen off the cliff and into so many ditches. You go out into society and you have no idea what you're going to encounter on a day-to-day basis, depending on where you live here in the States. So talk to us a little bit about attire and appearance. Why is that important? I feel like so many people just kind of, especially after working at home for a year and a half via Zoom for many, people fall out of bed in the morning in their pajamas and they go right to work. So what have we lost through the years in terms of having a gentleman's appearance?
Right. Well, the standard answer to that question, which is true, is that it shows respect to other people. Um, and that's true. I argue that it's actually, I prefer to say that it shows the desire to please other people. You want the default position to be, and to start with your appearance, that your desire is to make other people comfortable, at ease, happy, to give them pleasure, starting with just looking at you. And from it doesn't mean that you necessarily keep that intention with everyone that you encounter. You might decide otherwise, but that's the default position you start with. So you want to share your own taste in say clothing, and you want to give other people the feeling that you are starting out on a good basis with them. The other thing I emphasize, which I've not seen other people emphasize so much, is that a man's clothing, especially, is well. One thing that's important is that um, clothing becomes more gender specific, more sex specific, the more formal it becomes. In other words, very informal clothing is interchangeable between men and women, or as I say, between boys and girls. So it first of all it denies the importance of adulthood, because when we dress informally, we in some ways return to a childhood appearance. It also blurs the distinction between men and women, because the more we dress more formally we dress, the more we look specifically like men. And I think it's never in the interest of men to blur that distinction between men and women. A man's appearance is always something um, of a uniform, a man's attire. That's why a man's dress is usually the gray or the blue suit. In the 19th century, it was the black frock coat. A woman's dress is much more variable. There's much more room to express individuality, because a man's uh, kind of uniform type dress is an acknowledgement of an acceptance of duty, and that's why anyone wears a uniform, and that's why a man's dress is kind of a uniform. That men have responsibilities that they are acknowledging by the way they dress and comport themselves.
Well, and I'll tell a little story. So back in the day, I worked at a software company and I was in the tech support area, and we could wear jeans, t-shirts, tennis shoes, whatever. And about once a month, I would come in a full suit and a tie. And it was fascinating to see the way people reacted differently because on my floor, everybody knew me, and it wasn't a thing. But when I'd go upstairs to the executive level, if I was in my normal day-to-day work clothes, people would just kind of walk by and not really notice you. But if you go up there in a suit and tie, they assumed you were somebody important or somebody they should know or talk to. So I met all kinds of fascinating new people on those days that I went upstairs in the suit. But in my normal day-to-day tech support clothes, not so much. So just a fun experiment I ran back in the day that had some interesting results in terms of the people I got to meet. Next, Stephen, I'd love to have you talk to us a little bit about conversation and like what's appropriate to share. I feel like that's one of the things that's been extremely lost in culture, especially across generations. Just I guess maybe more broadly, like what does it look like for a gentleman to communicate these days?
That's a very difficult question. A little difficult for me to write that one because I sometimes I tend to be, and I think some gentlemen tend to be a little bit reclusive, and some even tend to be kind of misanthropic and antisocial in some ways. So that takes some effort. But of course, you have to make the effort. You have to make the effort to communicate with people, to communicate to people in plain English, to all people of all classes, all the people that you come in contact with, to do so without specialized jargon or slang of the kind, whether it's the slang of the street or the jargon of your workplace or the jargon of your educational level and so forth. I mean, we show that we are open to people and we're willing to talk to them. And any kind of snobbery, whether it's direct snobbery or inverse snobbery, of course, is completely contrary to the ideal of a gentleman. So you don't you avoid conversation subjects like your occupation. This obvious conversation starter, what do you do, is really not the best at all, and some consider it quite improper to discuss first initially your means of earning a living, your livelihood. So these are things. Some people argue that there's one part where I talk about the prohibition on politics and religion. These are two subjects that you should not discuss. And this is nothing original for me. This is standard in the old books. If you look at it, and I had a little trouble with that one myself because I love to. I teach my background is an instructor in politics, and I've recently, in many recent years, become very interested in religion. So I love discussing religion and politics. In my household, when we grew up, we discussed politics. We like to argue. We like to disagree. There's no offense taken by that. But it's not always possible with strangers, with people you don't know well. So I decided that the traditional books were correct, that politics and religion are subjects you should have convictions on, firm convictions, and you should stick to them if you have to, if you're forced to. But you just running off your opinions on things like that is sometimes a prescription for awkwardness or worse.
Yeah, I especially appreciated the section in the book where you talked about uh, just having, not necessarily having a plan, but knowing how to run a conversation in a large group or a dinner party or that sort of a thing. I think for people who've not been in those sorts of situations, to really think through those, that is very helpful. And also, too, and I feel like, especially with people who are up and coming, it can be a balance to figure out when to talk and when to listen. And on the one hand, we shouldn't be talking just to be heard, but on the other hand, we do need to have input. So I think, having solid convictions and things that we want to really press into in a conversation should things come up, I think it's important to be willing to share our opinions when they're important or when it adds to the conversation. Next, I'd love to have you speak to public speaking, rhetoric. I feel like one, public speaking is so many people's greatest fear, but really the art of speaking and communicating on a stage in front of a group. I feel like that's largely been lost for many people. Why is that important for the gentleman?
It's very important. It's a good question because I think I read somewhere that it's the number one phobia across society, which I can certainly understand. I have it myself when I have to speak on groups or on television and so forth. It's and it's like public speaking generally, you get better at it the more you do it. So it's a practice, but it's very important. It goes back to the heart of our democracy, of course, in the days before the media, in the days before television, public and print. Public speaking for the Greeks, for the Romans, was, of course, the only way that citizens could influence their republics and later their democracies. If you didn't want to leave government to the king and his entourage and the aristocracy, you had to be willing to speak publicly in the Greek agora, the Roman forum, or later on in the Renaissance. The art of public speaking and eloquence was resurrected. In the Protestant Reformation, the sermon became the means of communicating cultural ideas and even political ideas. So, if we don't want our political system, our social system, by default, to go to an elite of any kind, then we have to be willing to speak up and to do so thoughtfully and gracefully, because, of course, nobody wants to listen to a windbag. You have to learn to say things succinctly, concisely. I had to learn that as a teacher, because otherwise people go to sleep. So it's very important, and studying the arts of rhetoric, grammar, and so forth, of word usage, reading literature. These are the preparations for that.
And I would say that even extends into the digital sphere as well, in terms of presenting, communicating via video, which is so normal for us. How we prepare, the setting may be different, but a lot of those same skills apply in this kind of a setting via Zoom or Skype or what have you as well. Next, Stephen, I'd love to have you talk to us about education. It's no mystery that what people are being taught has changed from decade to decade. As we would say, well, when I was in school, I learned this. So I don't know that you're going to get the level of the kind of the gentleman's quality education as you lay out in the book. In a lot of our institutions today, you could get a lot of it just with a library card or on the internet these days. But in terms of, the gentleman having that well-rounded education, literature, history, music, why is that important? And if that was something you didn't have access to growing up, how can that be a part of your learning, growing experience, regardless of where you are in life?
That's a very critical question today, because, of course, our educational institutions have lost much of their original integrity. Uh, Primary education, secondary, and, of course, above all, perhaps the universities, where I taught for more than 30 years. So it was interesting to write that section, because I realized that it has some increased relevance today, as increasingly young men and women are often deciding to forego a university education. It's gotten so bad that many of them think they're better off spending 4 years and the accompanying funds for a better way to prepare for their lives. And they may be right about that. So there are I try to lay out the basic principles of a liberal education. A liberal education is important. The word liberal in that context comes from the word free. That again, in a free society, the people, the mass of the people are educated in some way. So I tried to lay out the principles by which a man can educate himself if he doesn't have a university education, if he missed one, or if he had a bad one, or if he's planning to go to a university, but may not get the education he wants, and how to make best use of an educational institution if you do go to one, and make up for some of the problems that you'll find there. The difficulty, of course, is if you educate yourself, you don't have necessarily the paper, the credential to show the rest of the world that you have this, and so it doesn't translate quite so easily into the job qualification that many people want today. And that's a challenge, of course. But I hope that whether a young man today decides is homeschooled, or goes to a public school or a private school or university, that he doesn't leave the education to others, doesn't approach it in a passive way and assume that he is going to be spoon-fed the things he needs from the instructors. Because I can tell you, as an instructor of many years, there are pressures on the instructors, even the good ones, to not deliver the goods in the way that they should. And you must take hold of your education, take charge of it yourself, and make sure that it's a quality one.
Well, and the one thing I would say too, in terms of even if you're later in life, reading, immersing yourself in things that, again, maybe you didn't get that chance to learn when you were in college or when you were coming up in school. The more we immerse ourselves into some of these areas, the more we understand the world. We see where ideas come from. Especially in study of history, we see why certain ideas have consequences, and maybe why they're bad ideas. We move ahead into the future. I shake my head at how often I've been talking to people about, if we're completely ignorant of history, whether we're talking world history, church history, depending on the context you're speaking into, we're often destined to repeat the same bad ideas or the same sins of the past. And, having a lack of education in all those areas really can predispose us to not being able to interact with and maybe challenge what we see going on in the world around us. So, my encouragement, no matter what stage of life you're in, keep reading, keep getting educated. Surround yourself with people who maybe are smarter than you or more well read than you, but who can have discussions with you and explore ideas. I always find that's helpful for sharpening and learning and just kind of moving forward with our own education. Next, Stephen, I'd love to have you talk to us about the battle between the sexes. How courtship, marriage, as a man, that's a huge part of our life as we're starting out and as we're getting established in the world. In terms of dating, relationships, marriage, everything else, it's kind of all over the place. I'd even say it's kind of a dumpster fire these days, especially just all the cultural confusion we have out there. So how does the gentleman approach courtship, relationship, marriage? What does that look like?
Yes, that's a very, very tangled subject, and it was a difficult part to write. I think that, as you say, in many ways, it attempts to first help men understand where the problem came from, why we are in this mess in a fairly clear way, and then how you can get out of it. And in some ways, I think that the point of that section of the book was to help men realize first that it starts with you. It starts with each one of us to get out of it. We can't undo the culture just by writing letters to the editor or letters to members of Congress or trying to change the political system and so forth. It starts with each one of us. And that's, our relationships with women, of course, are a very basic part of being a man, a gentleman, and one that is perhaps the most challenging today as to manliness. In many ways, today, the challenge to being a man, to being a gentleman, doesn't come from other men's masculinity. It comes from a culture that is hostile to masculinity itself, and as much of that comes from some women, but also women themselves are very much want men to be masculine men and masculinity. So it's a challenge. I argue that yes, courtship is definitely degenerated. Courtship used to be and marriage used to be an agreement between families. Families lost control of that as courtship. It turned into dating. It degenerated to devolved to the couple themselves. Dating then degenerated into hooking up, where the long term element disappeared and sex replaced love, and love itself became debased as a concept. And then it turned from there into kind of legal, cultural, and even legal warfare between the sexes, with accusations of semi crimes, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and so forth. So it's the very dangers that our grandparents at least had an inkling of have come to pass, and I try to help men negotiate that. It's a big subject. I emphasize, of course, that the enemy is not women. Of course, the enemy is a culture, but of course there are some women and some men who are part of that. And of course, you can't blame everything on the culture and on the society, because when the police come to your door, they won't put handcuffs on the culture and they won't put handcuffs on society. They'll put them on you. So you better understand, what's going on here.
Well, and it's almost time for us to wrap up, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I feel like so much of what we encounter in your book, like they're ignition points, or starting points to push us into maybe a new and a positive direction. In terms of the reader's journey with the book, somebody sits down, they read it from cover to cover. On the one hand, like what's the takeaway? What are the few like core things you hope every single reader discovers, and how do you hope that spurs them forward into really embracing the journey of becoming a gentleman?
I think that if I had to put it in a basic principle, it would be that a gentleman always takes the moral high ground. Um, we hear a lot today about victim culture. We hear a lot about whining. Men have not been very successful in complaining about the injustices to them. And there are many injustices directly toward men, and I think especially in the area of family law, which I've written on in the past. But it's not when men become the mirror image of others. It doesn't work. When men are perceived as complaining, whining, self pity, these are enemies to true manhood and to gentlemanly behavior. You've got to take the high ground. There are appropriate forums for asserting your rights. But it can never be a matter of running and telling teacher or telling the authorities. Or it has to be a matter of a man assuming the responsibilities for the world he's in, to put away his adolescent rebellion. This is a big one. I put this at the end. Perhaps I think many of us of my generation, growing up in the '60s and '70s, we when rebellion and protest were romanticized. I think it cost us a lot dearly. I think we learned that this was the way it became almost the norm. And so I tell men at the end to put away your self pity, of course, but also your rebellion. The man, the person, the ones that we should rebel against are our fathers. It's a father's role to help a young man rebel in a constructive way, and to channel his rebellion, his natural rebellion, into things that benefit not only himself but also society. A lot of men don't have fathers to teach them that today. So this book is an attempt to supply that need partly. But I think this is something we need to recover, of how to take the moral high ground, how to accept responsibility, and not see the world as a system of a litany of unfairness. And our role is telling the world about how unfair it is at every turn.
Yeah, I like that you bring up that challenge of rebelling against our fathers. It's a teaching time. It's a time of correction and shaping, and just rebelling against everything. While there may be consequences, but without that kind of correction, teaching, shaping aspect of it, it just seems to lead unto more rebellion. So definitely like that you brought that out at the close of the interview. Stephen, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about the book, where do we discover you on the web?
Well, they can look at my website, stephenbaskerville.com, Stephen with a PH, and they can find information about the book there, or on the website of Sophia Institute, publishers, Sophia Institute press.com / gentleman's guide. Um,
And like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes to Stephen's website, the publisher's website, and places where you can pick up your very own copy of this new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Stephen K. Baskerville. Once again, our book today was A Gentleman's Guide to Manners, Sex, and Ruling the World, How to Survive as a Man in the Age of Misandry and Do So with Grace. And Stephen, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me as well.